You know what time it is? It's time to get in the game with your host, Cynthia J.
Good evening and welcome to Get in the Game. Tonight we're having a very special conversation We Can't Breathe, and we thank you guys for joining us this evening. We would like to give our condolences and send our prayers to the family of George Floyd, who was laid to rest this morning in a private funeral there in Texas. To my left and to my right are two gentlemen here to discuss this story this evening and talk about how we can create change here in our very own city. To my left is Mr. George Lueders, a former retired JSO officer administrator for the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. And to my right is Dr. Irvin Pedro Cohen, who is the Vice President of Social Responsibility for the YMCA here in Jacksonville's Florida First Coast. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me here this evening. So let's start with you, Mr. George. You have been serving here in this city for JSO for over 32 years. Talk about what you've done here in the city of Jacksonville with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office.
Well, actually, I was hired at the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. Graduated from high school in June of '72 and was hired by the Sheriff's Office in October. And I worked my way through patrol all the way up to retired as Director of Investigations and Homeland Security. And when I retired from JSO, I taught for Federal Law Enforcement Training Center for 7 years. And then in 2013, Sheriff Leeper in Nassau County asked me to be his undersheriff. So I worked up in Nassau County for 5.5 years, and now I am retired.
Awesome. Retired, but still working for change here in the city, and we appreciate that. Dr. Cohen, you are a director at the YMCA. And so tell us first of all, you got your doctorate in what exactly?
Organizational leadership with a focus on urban education.
And what does that mean?
How to make things work better in the space of serving and moving humanity forward.
Awesome. And the reason why we definitely had to have you on the show is because your dissertation had a specific
it examined the role of the African American church post-civil rights, specifically in the areas of economics, health, and education.
Right. And so now you guys know, my viewing audience, why I have these two men here, because I definitely do not know enough myself to talk about this subject, this very sensitive subject. And we will start here, gentlemen, because I think it's important to point out that when the nation is going through something like this, everyone looks at their leadership. And so we know that several weeks back, our president, Donald Trump, tweeted something that, in my opinion, Twitter actually said it was a violation of Twitter's rules because it glorified violence. But they did say that they determined that it would be in the public's best interest to show the tweet. So we're going to show you the tweet right now. And I just want to read this point because I'm going to ask my guests what they think about this. So our president said, and I quote, because this is what he tweeted, "These thugs are dishonoring the memory of George Floyd, and I won't let that happen. Just spoke to Governor Tim Walz and told him that the military is with him all the way. Any difficulty and we will assume control. But when the looting starts, the shooting starts." And he ended that tweet with saying, "Thank you." Now, Gentlemen, I had to do some of my own research because I did not know what when the shooting starts meant. And actually, this was something said years ago by Walter Headley, a 20-year Miami police chief. And he said this back in Dade County when they were trying to get the city under control. In his words, he said it was a gift-up policy to declare war on young hoodlums, right? And he said, we don't mind police brutality. And that actually started a riot in 1980 because of the killing in 1979 of Arthur McDuffie, a 33-year-old Marine veteran who was pulled over by Miami-Dade police officers after running a red light on his motorcycle. And more than a dozen officers beat him into a coma, and he died days later of his injuries. Guys, when you see a tweet like this by our president, and knowing now where this phrase come from, when you first saw that and heard about that, what were your thoughts, Dr. Cohen?
I wasn't surprised, and it's indicative of the leadership that he has shown throughout his presidency. And so when you understand who he is and his lack of compassion, his lack of understanding of the situation in its entirety, you're not surprised that he would say something like that.
Now, Mr. Lueders, I'll turn to you because a lot of people were saying and assuming that when he made that comment, it kind of gave the American police force kind of right to literally do what he said. If you see looters, start shooting, don't ask questions. As a former officer, when you heard this statement made by our president, what were your thoughts?
Well, at first I thought it was a statement made as a deterrent. In other words, if you're going to loot, you're going to shoot. Of course, the next day, the White House came back and said that's not what he meant at all. He meant that he was going to bring the National Guard in or the military in when the shooting starts, because when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Whatever. One of the things, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, was actually in 1967 down in Miami, and we had a whole different set of rules in 1967. That was the civil rights movement that was going through in 1967. In 1967, we had a fleeing felon law. So if you actually broke into a store and I saw you fleeing from as a police officer, I could shoot you. In 1985, that was Garner versus Tennessee was the case that came out that stopped the fleeing felon law. So in other words, you could only shoot to defense of yourself or others. You could shoot a fleeing felon, but you had to be able to show that he was going to be dangerous, immediately dangerous. So it's like everything else that we're talking about here. There's a timetable where things have changed immensely. What President Trump meant by that statement, only him and God knows. I don't know what he meant. He said he didn't mean what it was taken. Whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we move on to the next thing I want to bring up, because we've heard a lot of backlash from just, people on social media, people in the news that don't understand the looting versus peaceful protest. And so you have some people saying that some of this looting is being caused by agitators, and then they're kind of throwing the stone and then pointing the finger at the black community. But I mean, in all retrospect, gentlemen, when we look at the videos, we are seeing a lot of that happening. So in your opinion, is it fair to say that some of the looting is started by agitators, and then it just is easy to kind of point the fingers at the black race because we are the ones that are typically enraged at the moment?
Well, I don't think it's just us that are enraged. I think if you look across the spectrum of people, and I think what makes this time different than any other previous time that you've had protests is that you see people who don't necessarily look like you, and you see people who don't necessarily look like you not just standing in the back, you see them on the front lines as well. Whatever their reasons for being there, I'm not going to speculate on whether they're there just to agitate the situation. All that I know is that they're there. And one of the things that I think has sort of surprised me about this is where the protests are taking place. If you were to come to me and say, hey, we're going to start a protest and we're going to do it in San Marco, I would say to you, I don't think that's a great idea. But it took people from San Marco young people who live in areas like San Marco to say, we're going to do it here. And so, you know, for me to look out into that, my TV or on the front lines and see people that look like me and say, this is not all right, says to me, makes me more hopeful than I have been at any other previous time in the history of our country, because it's not just me on the front lines sort of talking about the ghost in the machine that nobody wants to hear. If for no other reason, you know, George Floyd died, and I hate that the brother died, but he died, and he died for a cause.
Right.
And so his death was a cause. It was the match that, you know, America needed to see to deal with its past. And so I'm not going to say why people are there. Are they there to be looters, or they're there to be peaceful protesters? All I know is that they're there. I'm glad they're there, and I'm glad that they're keeping the pressure on our country to look at itself in the mirror and do better.
Absolutely. When you look at what happened here in Jacksonville, the day started off peaceful. You know, there were protesters out there. Actually, my sister went out there and said, you know, people were out there peacefully protesting, but people were angry. And she wasn't shocked that that peaceful protest turned into violence, where we then saw on our news station here, JSO vehicles being lit on fire, and the violence started. When you saw that, what ran through your mind, having been on the force all those years?
Well, there's two sections in a protest, and the sheriff's office first section of the protest was to provide security for the protesters, the peaceful protesters, and that's what they were doing. In other words, it was a large protest. The people who organized the protest had met with the sheriff's office, told them what they were going to do. The sheriff's office developed a plan, which is what we usually do a major event. You develop a plan, and then you change when it changes from peaceful protests to violent acts. You change from security to enforcement.
Okay.
So that's when you saw the guys in the field force. That's when they lined up, and I really think that the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office did an excellent job, because they met the threat head on. Now that the normal protesters, the peaceful protesters, had left. They were gone. I mean, they knew that thing was over at 6 or whatever time, and they got in their car and they went home. Well, a crowd of about 200 to 400 people stayed. And what you were talking about, was there any people that are in there that are pointing their fingers at blacks? I had two. One of them was one of the people that was commanding it tell me some of the biggest problems they had were white males age 18 to 25. Wow. And what they were doing was they were mixing in with the African-American black guys, inciting them to do violence. At one point in time, I think it was on the news that they arrested one guy who showed up Sunday, and he was a white male, and he went up and says, all right, y'all ready to fight and tear some stuff up? So he was actually turned in by the protesters. We don't want any part of that. So yeah, there is a big difference, because when you're protesting, that's your right to protest peacefully. When you're looting, you're committed a criminal act. That's what you're doing. And here's my point on that. In the cities where they allow looting and rioting to go on for a couple of days before they come in mass and they stop it, the shop owners expect the same protections from the police that individuals do. In other words, let's just do a hypothetical here. Me and my wife own a shop, and it's the only thing we have in our names, and we're in a neighborhood, and so we're in Minneapolis. I see a crowd coming toward me, and I get on the phone and call the police. Look, I think they're fixing to loot my store. We're not responding to those calls. So they come through the door, and protecting my store, I shoot a looter. Or a guy coming in, I shoot him and kill him. And so the police do come now because somebody shot, and they take me to jail. And when I'm going to jail, they burn my business down. So where is the justice? And I know we're going to talk about the justice system, but where is the justice in that for me, the store owner? The police have failed you. I mean, the governmental agency that's supposed to protect you has failed you. So I would suggest get a lawyer.
I would tend to agree with you that I don't think any right-minded person would agree with looting under any circumstances. But I think there's a palatable rage that goes through the entire process. I also feel that while I'm not supporting looting on any level, at the end of the day, it's stuff. It's stuff that can be replaced, and it's stuff by and large that people have insurance around. So, you know, while I don't support the idea of of looting, I do say that those are just things, and I have a very difficult time. I would have a very difficult time, me personally, killing someone or taking someone's life because they were walking out my store with Pampers they didn't pay for, or a TV they didn't pay for. It's just a thing. And so with that much anger, rightful anger, based upon the circumstances, all of that goes somewhere. And the very same agency that you call is the very same agency that you're raging against. And so, again, I want to be very clear that I'm not supporting looting in any capacity. I fundamentally think that that is wrong to damage someone's property.
Can I address that?
Yeah.
You have black and white looters
Right.
together now. I mean, on every video you can see on TV in every city,
Right.
It's not just black people looting, it's white people looting.
Right.
So the rage that's directed is toward Black Lives Matter. In other words, the George who was killed by a white officer, and that's the rage. That's where it's at.
Right.
So when you have white individuals that join with black individuals, to me that is an opportunity for crime. And that's what they're doing, is taking advantage of an opportunity for crime. They may be mad, they may be raged, but they can do other things besides go in and destroy buildings and set fires and
I agree with you
Right.
100% on that point. I just say the conditions that created that, it's when you have that much anger directed at an agency,
right.
that regardless of the color of skin of the people that were there, that is a recipe for a lot of misdirect, particularly when you're bringing people who, you know, one group is there because of the situation and another is there to disrupt
some stuff.
everything else.
Yeah.
When you bring those people together, I think it's just a recipe for disaster, and no one wins, quite frankly, in that situation.
Right.
And we can kind of stay on this topic, but I do want to move on because it brings up this next point. Because when we saw the looting and we saw some of the peaceful protesting turning into it was maybe a mix of peaceful protesting versus rioting, we then began to see videos surfacing of police brutality in a different light, and it brought anger in some communities that I think kind of magnified what was going on. When now you see, and when you look at the numbers, first of all, Minneapolis has said that 9 out of 13 city council members have announced their intent to disband the city's police department because of what has been going on. And there have been at least 5 deaths during the protest in these 15 days. Now, all 50 states have joined in the protesting, which is the first we've ever seen. We've never seen anything like this in its kind. So obviously, when you have that, there are some unknowns, right? And then almost 200 cities were put on curfew. And then you have over 50 countries that joined us in the protest. 74,000 National Guards, over 74,000 National Guards were dispatched because of the rioting and the looting that we saw. But then we saw some police brutality that was shocking, and had some people saying, listen, the same people that we're expecting to protect us are now harming us, when some of these people were peacefully protesting. And I'm sure you've seen some of those videos. What were your thoughts, having been an officer that long, when you're seeing officers being fired, put on leave, charges brought up against them for pushing a protester too hard, or causing bodily injury with the weapons that they have against what seemed to be and appeared to be peaceful protesters?
Well, of course, there's another side to every story. There's been over 700 officers injured
right.
in these riots. So what you're asking officers to do is you're asking them to move people who don't want to be moved. You're asking them to stop people from throwing bottles who don't want to stop. So you're putting the police is the barrier. That's it. I mean, that is, the police is what sits between us and anarchy. So when you call the police out to stop a riotous situation, there are going to be instances where force has to be used. I mean, it's a fact of life. And there probably are videos of police using force. We've all seen the videos of the rioters. There's more people with cell phones taking videos than there is doing anything else. They're all over the place. I mean, they're videoing everything, and they're trying to get every angle, and they're trying to provoke the police, and trying to get the police to do something so they can get a video, and they can post it of police brutality. Now, did some police brutality go on? I'm sure it did, okay? Because you cannot be in a situation where you're required to make people do things they don't want to do and not use force. I mean, that's just the way it is. And we put the police, law enforcement, in that arena.
Situation.
You do. I mean, you're placed in that arena, and then you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. So if you can't move those people because you don't want to hurt them, they got to be moved and they got to go home. So they start moving you toward them, and violence breaks out.
And that's what happens. And we've seen some people say that we are seeing the true colors of our American police system. Do you agree with that statement?
Again, I think that's a statement that paints a broad brush. Yeah. And I think it's very difficult to paint every police department with a broad brush. Do you have bad actors within the department? Absolutely, yes. And I think, you know, the challenge that I have with the idea of, I don't think anybody wants to disband law enforcement. I don't think that's what it is. But I do believe that if you talk about disbandment, you bring attention to almost an agency that gets, in the city of Jacksonville, gets a third of your budget, but has zero accountability to the people that pay for you to be there. And so I think talk of disbandment is the public's way of saying to you, you will be accountable. You will be accountable. If you use your weapon, then within this amount of time, you will produce a body camera, or if it's available. And I think the talk of disbandment is a way for the public to take control of an entity or an agency that it pays for. I mean, would we be having this conversation if the scenario had played out the same way with George Floyd and nobody had a video? Would that officer and his accompanying officers be able to say, we felt threatened for our life, thus we killed him? And my answer would be, probably not. We wouldn't have a conversation. We wouldn't, because we've been here before. We've had a scenario where another gentleman said, I can't breathe, and he was still choked to death. And our lying eyes told us something different. And so I think people have just gotten to a point now where they're demanding accountability. And I don't think that they're against the police department at all, because if I was to walk out this door tonight and someone accosted me with a gun, I would call the police and want immediate justice. So I don't think that's what a reasonable minded person is saying, but I am saying that people now are demanding accountability for an agency that gets that much money, that says I don't have to show you anything, and I could hide behind the idea of I felt threatened for my life.
Can I address that?
Sure.
One second. I'll let you address it in a second, because I do want to bring up this point because you brought it up. So we did find out that none of those officers in the situation had their body cams on. So it's almost,
you got a body cam, but you don't have it on.
Right, you don't have it on. And so
I think the chief was fired over that.
Right, I believe so. So when we look at, okay, your police officers are there to protect us, and you've also explained what else they're there to do. And in that situation, there's no body cam, and it's so hard to say it, but thankfully other people were recording it so that we didn't want to see how and why it happened, but we did. Go ahead and make your statement.
That position in Minneapolis was atrocious. When you have civilians telling you he can't breathe, he's dying, and nothing is done, it's atrocious. I mean, and we all saw it. We all saw the video. In Jacksonville, officer-involved shooting, body cam. That is evidence that's turned over to the state attorney's office. State attorney's office makes the decision when it can be released. They're holding the sheriff's office responsible, the community is, about the release of body cams. It is not the sheriff's office, because once they undergo a police shooting or an officer-involved shooting, the state attorney's office gets the case, investigates the case, and they get all the evidence. So body cam is part of that evidence. So when the state attorney's office decides that we can release that body cam video, it's when it's released. They're working on that policy now because they realize it's a problem.
But you're asking me, as a Joe Q citizen whose son, daughter, loved one has just been shot by a police officer who has on body cam,
Right.
for an agency that I pay into, I can't get any information about.
I understand that. I
And so
do understand that.
yeah.
And it's always been a problem. So what we need to work on is communication between the sheriff's office and the state attorney's office. When I was in Nassau County, we had several police shootings up there. The state attorney's office gets it, and then they investigate it, they roundtable it, and then they send a letter out telling you whether the shooting was justified or not or whatever. It's taken over a year and a half to get those letters.
Wow.
So now you've got a deputy that you can't sit on a desk for a year and a half in a place like Nassau County who doesn't have that much resources. So he's back on the street, and we're waiting on responses from the state attorney's office. So Melissa Nelson has said we're going to see how we can expedite that process. Well, that's one of the things that needs to be worked on.
Right.
And the sheriff admitted that too. Now, how do I explain to you that your loved one was shot and killed, and I can't tell you or show you anything about it? It's tough. It really is.
And again, I think the idea of defunding that entity is nothing more than my ability to get your attention.
Right.
You know, and I think in our society, particularly one that understands finances, is that when you want to get an entity's attention, you immediately start to talk about, well, we're not going to spend money with you, and/or I'm going to defund you. And so I think that's the way that's what they, because we've done it every other way. We've done it every other way except for defund.
And one of the things that modern day law enforcement faces is you're everything to everybody. So you have all the different programs that you try to run, and you try to make things better in the community. So one of the definitions of defunding that I heard was that we're going to defund you from those programs, and we're going to have somebody else do it. Well, let me tell you something. That would be a relief, because then you could go back to doing what you're supposed to be doing. When the police were formed in this country, they were formed to protect life and property. That was it. That was the reason they were formed. Now, we have evolved into a whole different arena, but that basis is still there. That's what you're there for, is protect life and property. So, I mean, under Sheriff Glover, we were talking about Nat Glover earlier. Nat Glover was a great sheriff. He brought a lot of social programs, and he brought a lot of stuff to the communities, cookouts, community. But we had the biggest law enforcement problem with corruption under Nat, and it was like, I can see him saying, what else can I do? You know, because you can't take the human factor out of police officers. You can't do it. So, I mean, you can train them as much as you want to, but there's still that human factor there.
I absolutely agree with you in that regards, and I don't think that that's why I don't believe that all officers are bad.
They're not.
You know,
take my word
there
for it.
There are people, when they, you know, and I'm a firm believer that when that officer leaves his house in the morning, he says to his family, I'll see you when I get off of work. And so, and we're asking them to go into some pretty dangerous situations. However, I think that if you take the job, there's a higher level of accountability that you have when you said this is a career choice that I'm going to make.
And you agree on that.
And
I think and you know, in reality, law enforcement is held to a higher standard. They should be, and they are. And the reason that I say that is because if a doctor gets arrested for DUI, or a lawyer or anybody else, you don't even hear about it. But if a police officer goes out and breaks the law, it's on every newscast.
And they have the capacity to kill me.
Oh, they do.
They have the capacity to kill
they
me.
Are
so
the
you should
only,
be.
The
You should
only
be held
profession
accountable.
in this country that in the performance of their duty, they can take an American citizen's life. That is a tremendous responsibility.
And I do believe at the same token that those very same people who have the capacity to take my life should be held at a different standard, as well as they don't get to hide behind the shield and say to a guy who's clearly running away from me and I shoot you in the back and kill you, to say I felt threatened for my life.
Well,
okay, so let's.
I'm just saying.
I understand.
Okay, so because this goes into my next question, and we're going to show an image to the viewers. I want these. If my producers can pull up this image that I want to show you guys. You guys can't see it, but I want to show each of you this image. So this is an image that was posted on social media. And it's basically expressing kind of what you guys are talking about. But I want to bring this up because you went to Ribault during segregation. So you saw, segregation happen. You happened to run a YMCA in one of the toughest parts of Jacksonville. And so your YMCA, as you're looking at this, your YMCA is a place where families have repasses after funerals of young men that are killed in our streets of Jacksonville over there in your area. When you see this image, which basically, and my viewers are seeing it right now, when you see this image, what is the solution? Is there a solution?
I do believe that there is a solution. And I think that we, again, when I look out into the riots, and I call it the revolution, when I look out at the revolution today, I am hopeful because, and I'm making an assumption, if you X out all of the looters, I am hopeful again because now that, when all of those young people that are on the front line that are saying that this is not acceptable to me. This is not acceptable to me, and I'm willing to stand arm in arm with somebody who's a different hue than me, makes me hopeful that images like that we can get past. Is it going to take work? Absolutely it's going to take work, but I'm more hopeful now than I've ever been in my entire life around the possibility that we have the capacity to be the country, the moral authority that we like to tout that we are all around the world.
Well, I really think there is going to be some change, and that usually after civil discord, there is a change that comes about, however small, however big. I don't think there's going to be change in people until their hearts are changed, and I really don't think that we as humans have the capability to do that. If people would turn to God and do what they say they believe in, then they would have a change of heart. And if you have a change of heart, then people will get along. But the way we do things is so, and I'm not making this a racial thing, but it's so black and white. It's so, you got to do this or you got to do that. You got to do this, you got to do that. When in reality, life is gray. You have to make decisions on the run all the time. You really do. It just, I don't think, and I've been doing this is in my lifetime, in 1964, the Civil Rights Act, the riots that followed that. Then you had the Miami thing in 1980, the riots that followed that. You have riots that occur throughout the country. I've never seen one this big, believe me or not. I mean, a protest this big and this far around the world. I have learned something in 45 years of law enforcement. Data means nothing. Perception is reality.
Right.
So I can give you all the figures in the world about how only 9 unarmed black men were killed last year. Okay?
In Jacksonville?
Nationwide.
Okay.
9 unarmed black men. So that's down from like 280 in 2015. Wow. So we're making, you can see progress on statistical stuff. But the perception of the people of this country is that the police are heavy-handed and police are not doing their job like they're supposed to, then it's a reality. And the police departments and law enforcement agencies have to do a look and see what could we change to possibly change perception. It's very hard to do, and especially in the African American community, because what's going on in Chicago right now with all the murders, and everybody always talks about Chicago. Well, there's a silence up there. In other words, the killings go on, but there's no information about who did it, and nobody will talk. It's going on here. It's the same way. So if we could get people, and if we could get the communities and law enforcement to trust each other enough to give information, and I realize there's a myriad of problems with that. I mean, there's retribution, there's people that are scared in their own houses. One guy told me, he says, you know, as a police officer, I can look at somebody and tell they know who committed the crime, but you can see it in their eyes that they're scared to tell you. So, you know, they started a Crime Stoppers thing so that you don't have to give your name. They'll even pay you for information if you want to do that. But until there's a cooperation between law enforcement and the community, these crimes are going to continue. And that's what we need to be working on, is how we get the communication between the police and the community.
But I think therein lies the problem. Only 9 died, but we don't account for the mental anguish that another 9,000 have experienced at the hands of the police.
That's true, and that's not measurable.
You're right.
That's
it's not measurable.
That's right.
But when I could line up 15 African American men, and they all have a story associated that was not a good story about their interaction with the police, all because of race, that to me is problematic. And I think that at the core of the problem in terms of African Americans' relationship with the police, it all stems from that. If all you see me as is a prop in a neighborhood that you have to come do a job that's very difficult in, and I just so happen to be one of those props in that neighborhood, then your interaction with me is going to be different.
Right.
And therein lies the problem. Why am I going to give some advice or give some information to people who have been antagonistic against me in my own neighborhood simply because I am an African American? So you're asking me to help you when 2 weeks ago, one of your officers who wear your uniform just jacked me up and threw me against the wall for nothing more than standing right here on a corner.
Dr. Cohen, let me ask you something. Who does that hurt? It's not hurting the police because all you have is an unsolved crime. It's hurting your community because you're not helping the criminal justice system as we know it, which is the police, the state attorney, the courts. If you're not getting involved in that, then nothing will be done. But the violence will continue.
I agree with you there. And I don't want to, I think there's this perception because I live in a community that's challenged economically, it's challenged educationally, it's challenged from a health standpoint, it's challenged with all those. Because I live in this community, for some reason, I don't want to be safe. I want to be safe. You know, please don't get it twisted. I want to be safe.
Right.
However, I look at you as just as much of the enemy as I look at the guy who killed somebody in the neighborhood. I hold you all in the same regards.
So
I just don't.
How do I change your image?
You change. I mean, again.
Is that possible?
Well, I'm talking about heart. I've got to change my heart, and you got to change yours.
I got to change my. I mean, my heart is around how you've treated me, and I think that we have to do a better job of. You can't take a 21-year-old officer who's just fresh out of the academy, who had very little interaction with African Americans, and then you stick him in a community of color and say, go do your job. I don't have any interaction with you as a person, so I see you as a threat.
Yeah.
And so I think we have to do a better job there.
That's a good point. Let me ask you all this, because this is something that, you know, we are in the day and age of 2020. So we are far removed from 1960, where there was no cell phones, no social media. The media in general, meaning the news media, was definitely not as heightened and as used as it is now. So is a lot of what the problem we're seeing coming from the media perspective as well, based on what the images that, and I mean, it's easy to say because I'm a part of the media. So the images that are being pushed, does that kind of add a level of anger and hatred to this that we didn't see before when it was just a matter of what people were visually seeing physically?
Well, I think you can go back to the inception of our country and how they defined African Americans. They never defined African Americans as being equal or human. I mean, our very own Constitution, you know, said that you are 3/4 of a person. And so that builds upon the image that the media has today. I think, again, we are better. We're getting better because now I can sit across from you and you see me as just another guy.
Dr. Cohen.
You see me as that.
Right.
And so I think we are at a better place. But I think the media, this whole image of who I am as a man, who I am as a citizen of this country, started from the very inception of our country. And so we're trying to erase that piece of it.
It is pulling down these Confederate monuments and statues, and we can only talk about what's going on in Jacksonville. Is that going to help?
I don't know. I don't know if it's going to help or not, because we were talking about this earlier. What Mayor Curry has done is he's made an executive decision. In other words, he's made a decision that I'm going to pull them down. Now, what he based those decisions on, he hasn't told anybody on why he did it, and he did it under the cloak of night, which has a lot of people upset because they, you know, it seems like he's sneaking this through. There are several things that I think are contributory to this, and one of them was when the Jaguars were at the sheriff's office, and Chris Conley talked about a couple of times a Confederate monument less than a mile from here that is a reminder of the old times. Well, Mayor Curry's trying to get the RNC here. So I don't know if that's what did it, but I do know that I watched the news around what has occurred, and that has occurred, and now he's come out. Now this has been, when we talked about this, and Dr. Cohen, this has been discussed for 2 years in
Right.
Jacksonville with no really remedy in sight as far as the city council sees it. So he made a decision, and I teach class on making decisions. If you make good decisions, you get rewards. You make bad decisions, you get consequences. He's in a position where he's made a decision where he's going to get both. He gets rewards from people who are happy about his decision, and there's really a ton of consequences that are coming because he has a large group of people that are mad about it. So is it going to help? I don't know. I have no idea if it's going to help.
I mean, you know, I'm probably one of those rare people who don't care anything about those statues, quite frankly.
Have you ever been down there to look at it?
Yeah, I have. And
I haven't.
let me tell you why. Let me tell you why.
I've lived here 66 years.
Because they mean something to somebody.
Yeah.
But what I don't want to have is my tax dollars going to support them.
Right.
And so if you're going to have them in public spaces, then
I had an African American male tell me, older man, I don't want to see them taken down. He said, because I'm not going to be here forever to tell what the South used to be like. He said,
I share
I
that
want those
point.
to be reminders.
I share that point of view.
Wow. Right.
But again, if you want to put them in your front yard, I'm okay with that.
Right.
I don't care, but don't put them in public spaces that my tax dollars go to remind me of the subjugation of people that look like me.
Speaking of your tax dollars, we talked about this too. When you get all these statues down, what do you do with them?
I have no problem. Sell them.
Well, that's what you're supposed to do with
Sell
city
them.
equipment. You're supposed to auction it off. So
I
it'll
would
be
auction
interesting
them
to
off
see.
to somebody and
Right.
say, you know what?
Put them on
I
your
would
property.
Put them on your property. If you would like for them to, if you like them that much, put them on your property.
Now, let me pose this to you, and we're going to run off topic just quickly because this brings up a point. So, you know, a couple weeks ago, my sister and I went into Brunswick, Georgia, and there was a walk that had been organized for Ahmaud Arbery. And as we walked through this neighborhood, that's all we saw. That's a lot of what we saw. And it was very offensive, maybe just to my generation, the millennial generation, because all I've heard about in my 35 years of living is what my ancestors faced, what my parents went through that grew up in segregation. The last thing I want to see in 2020 in a neighborhood where there were mostly Caucasian people living there. We did not see any African Americans that own homes there. And we're walking through this neighborhood where this young black male's life was hunted down and taken. I don't want to see that. It's offensive to me.
Again, there are many things that are offensive to me. I mean,
there are a lot of things.
What's offensive to me is somebody wearing tights that probably shouldn't have on tights. That is offensive to me. But it's on them.
Their body.
It's
right.
on their body.
Right.
I have no problem with that. If again it's on your property, then I'm fine with that. I know I don't want to do commerce with you because that's how you feel. It gives me the option. When it's on public space, not only does it not give me an option, but I'm paying for it.
Okay.
I don't want to do that, and you're taking away my choice. That's how I feel.
When you talked about being up in Brunswick, one of the things that really sits hard with me is that they're including him, young man that was killed up there, as a law enforcement casualty. None of those people were law enforcement, and the guy who was actually the former investigator for the state attorney's office up there, district attorney's office, hadn't even been certified in like 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 years.
But he had the luxury of having law enforcement intercede on his behalf.
Well, I agree with that.
Had we not had that video, then guess what? We would not be talking about that young man who lost his life.
I agree with that. And if you want to talk about the inequities in the criminal justice system, they're there on both sides. I mean, they really are. And it's the major thing in criminal justice inequity is, do you have money or you don't have money?
I still think that there is no difference. I think there's a huge difference, because you can be a person of color with money, and the criminal justice system works for you the same way it does if you didn't have any money.
Well, that's
only difference is you get a better lawyer.
You get a better team of lawyers.
When you get a better team of lawyers, your chances of beating whatever you're charged with, and Epstein is a good example of that. All the stuff that he went through, and the amount of money, and he hired Dershowitz, and he hired a whole band of people and he went in there, and the first time he got like 8 months. You know, right.
So if you have money, there's a lot that can be. Now, in Georgia, I can't believe that she sat on that for as long as she did without somebody, GBI or somebody, coming in and going, where are you at on this case? Because I mean, it's pretty obvious what was going on. He used to work for her.
Right.
You know, and that's
again,
it's a travesty.
I think as an African-American male, the scales get tilted upward just a little bit more towards justice when you have resources, but not enough to make it a balanced playing field.
Oh, no, I agree.
I still say that you still have 12 jurors in that box who still, regardless of your resources, still have the capacity to see you as an African-American male and make a decision about you.
In the criminal justice system, they don't make it before there's 12 jurors because of the wheeling and dealing that goes on to get them to do plea agreements. So, I mean, if you get somebody, if you're taking a chance, if you're rolling the dice, because your lawyer says you may do very well and they may acquit you, and they don't, then you've lost. I mean, there's no in between on that. So.
And so let's move on to, because, you know, part of the reason why we wanted to do this show is to give our audience hope, especially my generation, who the generation you said is out in front. But we've had conversations. There are people that are hopeful, but then there are people that are hopeless, and there are definitely people in this time that want to be an ally, but they don't know how to be. So can you guys give advice from your perspective as a black male? What even some of your counterparts who you work with, white males, Mexican males, you know, all other races, what can people do to be an ally during this time?
So I had someone come and ask me that, and he was a business leader in our city. And what I told him is that in his space, he has the opportunity to create opportunities. You know, I'm not looking to give people a pity story around my interaction with law enforcement. That's not what I'm looking to do. But what I am interested in is for opportunities. And I'm not some anomaly. I'm an African American with a doctorate degree. However, I know a gang of African Americans with doctorate degrees. And none of us are asking for you to do anything but remove the systematic barriers that have been placed in place over the years that prevent that. I think by and large, my community wants the same things. You know, the people that live off of Kings Road want a grocery store. They want access to
Publix too,
and
not
they want access to quality health care. They want all of the same things that their counterparts who don't look like them want. And so I think if we start to humanize people and see what you want to be able to go to have fresh fruits and vegetables like me, and we work collectively together to create those same opportunities, then I think you will get people and we'll get to that euphoric place that we want to go. But right now, as long as it's okay for them to build 5 grocery stores in town center and not one on the north side of Jacksonville, we by and large check off on systematic racism.
Well, there's things, economic things, that are beyond my control. I mean, I'm here representing law enforcement, but I do see what you're talking about. In Gateway Shopping Center, when Dixie left, Publix moved in. Now Publix moved out. Harvey's is in, which I think is when Dixie or
When Dixie is there now.
When Dixie's back. So, and it seems like we have a lot of things backwards in this country, because the areas where people have limited transportation, the areas where people can't get out and do the things they need to do, they don't have resources to even go to. And I agree with you on that. How do you convince those people, the grocery store people, that they need to get involved in the community and put a store where you're talking about?
But I think that conversation, so to the overarching term for what you're talking about is the commodification of people.
Right. And
however,
it involves money.
You are more likely to be in the room when that conversation is had than I am. If you look around the room in terms of when a decision is made to provide a necessary resource in a community of color or not, the likelihood of people being in the room that has somebody who's going to be adversely affected by that is nil. I can assure you it wasn't a majority of African Americans in the room when they said we're going to close the Publix in Gateway. Not to knock on Publix. This is not a conversation about them.
No,
but it wasn't people
right.
who would be adversely impacted by that decision. It was, by and large, people who look like you. And so at the end of the day, we have to have people that's sitting at the table who understand truth and are prepared to speak truth to power. And truth to power may come with some risk. And that risk is you might not get the check that you was promised.
Well, let me ask you
that has
this.
to be okay.
Shouldn't that be one of the duties of our elected officials from those areas, that they meet with the people in corporate America and try to bring those businesses to their area?
I don't think that we don't get to, hold them accountable, because we do. And every 4 years we get to say you did a good job or a bad job. But again, the one thing that's consistent is generally when those decisions are being made, they are generally made by people who don't have any experience with people of color.
But me and you can't change that. And that's
where. But
that's
I want to believe that we are at that place and space and time where that tide is changing. When one of the founders of Reddit steps off the board of directors and say this spot is going to go to someone of color. We are at a different time. And I'd rather be on the right side of time than saying what I can't do. I just believe that it's all. I mean, I believe that it's possible. We just have to have the conversation.
And that was a good example, because he did step down. Now we just have to see if Reddit is going to respond or not. So that'll be something interesting to watch. So as we're getting ready to close out, again, the question: was how do people become an ally during this time?
I think there's a lot more people who are not marching. So I think
That should be?
no, there's a lot of people who are not marching but are staying home. And I think that is your biggest ally. And that's where it's so important that the protest remain protest and not get violent. Minneapolis had the whole world. They had the whole world
Watching.
Everybody agreed that was bad and that was wrong. They started protesting, they still had the whole world until they started rioting. When they started rioting, the people who are sitting at home who can actually make a change turned their TVs off. And that's a problem. I mean, because they had the whole world. The whole world was watching them, and they were doing a good job, and they were peacefully protesting, and they were angry, and everybody understood that. But then when it turned to violence, America didn't want to see that. You know, so the people sitting at home, not marching, that's where your allies are at. Those are the people who you have to win over as your allies, because I can assure you, the people who are demonstrating are very small microcosm. They look like a huge crowd, but when you get 2,000 or 3,000 people that are demonstrating in New York City, that's 9 million people live there. So if you start looking at numbers, that it looks big, and but there's a lot of people that are sitting at home watching this on TV that won't march, that even support your cause, but won't go down and march because they don't want to get involved in something where violence is going to take place. So your allies are actually at home. I mean, those are the people who are your allies. So the people who are on the city council, the people who are the representatives for the areas, they need to start having some meetings. They need to start, I heard Sheriff Williams say, I'm open to anybody who can give me some good dialogue and maybe some change will occur. But here's the thing, and I admire him for this. He said, I don't want a photo op. I don't want you to come down here and take our picture and then I don't hear from you again. We're walking arm in arm because we want to do some change. Let's have some meaningful dialogue. If you just want my picture, I don't care about that. And I'm afraid that a lot of the stuff that people doing that we see on TV is just that.
Photo op.
It's photo ops.
Wow.
And they've been doing it for 30, 40 years. They've been, I mean, let's go to the top. We can't get our Congress to do anything. They're at each other's throats. And it goes all the way down from there to local. I mean, that's just the way it is. So how do you get those people that we elect to cross the aisle and start talking to each other and let's do what's good for the American people? I don't know, because I've been looking and praying for that to happen and I hadn't seen it.
Well, we're in here. Gentlemen, thank you so much. This show could go on for several hours, and depending on our response, we may have to have you back. But I'll close with this because our purpose here at Get in the Game, to kind of go off the Richter scale of what you're used to seeing us produce, which is sports shows, was to give our viewing audience hope. And so I'll say this. There is a scripture in Mark chapter 12, verses 28 through 31, and I'm paraphrasing, but there was a teacher of the law that posed a question to Jesus, and he said, "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment?" And Jesus' response was to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the next greatest commandment, like unto it, is to love your neighbor as yourself. And so my question to the viewers is, could the change that we need to see here in the city of Jacksonville, in the state of Florida, and on throughout the country, does it start with you? Does your love for yourself have that much to do with the love that you have for your brother or sister? Because the fact and the truth of the matter is this: whether you're shot, stabbed, killed, run over by a car, or you lose your breath because the knee of a man's leg is cutting off your circulation, we all bleed the same color blood. And so I say to you, do some soul searching yourself and see if we can start with change with you. Thank you for joining us this evening here on Get in the Game. You guys, tune in next week as we kind of shift gears and maybe turn to another topic. But we definitely want to send our condolences to the George Floyd family and the family members of those who've also lost their loved ones at the hands of police brutality. Have a great evening.